All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Can. I am here with Linkso, and we have Mark Bourne again. Welcome, Mark. I know you did a class for us last year. This is the part 2 to that class, and it's not really, well, I don't really know the format, Mark. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, but is this a follow-up to the class that you did last time? And if so, I've already included that link there in the chat.
It is actually, it's funny that probably this should have been the part 1, but it came second. So
no particular order.
Yeah, you can make of that what you will.
Yeah. Well, welcome, Mark. I'm going to just turn the class over to you, and I'll talk to you after your lecture's over, and I'll ask you the questions from the attendees.
Great. Thank you, Can. Thank you for the introduction.
Yeah.
You know, so it's funny actually, in the while Can and I were getting ready for this, we were just talking about the classes, and I've been teaching classes with Linkso for about 20 years now. And of those 20 years, about half of them have been in Seattle. And so it's kind of funny because usually your materials vendors materials are heavy and they don't go very far. But I think as I was thinking about that myself, it's really a testament to kind of the quality of people and the quality of service at Linkso that it's this relationship that has survived that long and really been thriving. And so that's my thank you to Can, and also thank you to Linkso for all of these years of this great connection that we've had and working together and building gardens together. So, and also thank you everybody for joining today. It's great to be able to be here with you, to have a chance to talk about this. A lot of what I usually teach is hands-on or kind of very practical nuts and bolts, kind of the how to build Japanese gardens. You know, that's what I do. I am an academic and a garden designer and builder, but the easiest part by far is to show people lots of pretty pictures of gardens and to talk about how to, you know, how Japanese gardens fit together. What are the parts that make them work? And so the first lecture I gave that was in this series was this idea of reading Japanese gardens, and that lecture, like I said, probably should have come after this one, but the idea was that the garden itself is what's directly right in front of you, and when you're kind of looking at it, almost everything you need to know about the garden is just what's right there in front of you. There's a lot of talk in symbolism in Japanese gardens and about hidden meanings. And it's more like if you think about poetry, for example, if you think about Shakespeare's poetry, there's a lot of grammar that goes into Shakespeare's poetry and a lot of complex rules and, you know, the rhyming and iambic pentameter and whatnot. But at the end of the day, the thing that actually makes the poem poetic is the skill of the poet, that there's just that thing that's right there in front of you, that you don't actually... Following the rules isn't what makes the poem work. The poem is what makes the poem work, and the rules kind of are there, but they come, you know, afterwards or beside. So that being said, the place I started out, where almost everybody starts out with Japanese gardens, unless you have the fortune of growing up in Japan, the place where I started out with Japanese gardens was, you know, an interest in kind of vaguely oriental things probably in high school. That kind of started out for me just being kind of, you know, enjoying the Japanesey kinds of things that I would find around. And then taking Japanese language as an undergraduate, having a Japanese minor as an undergraduate. And while I was doing that, I wrote a thesis. I wrote a 90-page paper on literary aesthetics in the Tale of Genji, which is this 11th century, written in around 1025. The Tale of Genji was written, and this first slide is an image from an illustrated scroll, right? So this is at that period in time in Japan. We're talking about books or tales, really, these monogatari, these tales being in the form of scrolls, and this is an image from one of the scrolls in the Tale of Genji. And I think everybody will, this flowering tree, right, in Japan, it's these 5 petals. And if you look at these, the cherry trees in Seattle are flowering now, wherever you are. It's, I hope you're enjoying spring. Ken was telling me that the Bay Area is having gales, which is a little bit different. But these split flowers, right? So you can kind of look at this and recognize this courtyard and this architectural scene, and kind of looking at the tale of Genji. And also, for me at that time, thinking about wanting to go to Japan, and when you're reading these kind of old novels or these old tales, and you're exposed to Japan, you're exposed to it in a way that's exotic. Not necessarily in a bad way, but it is this kind of the framework is it's far away, and some of that appeal is that kind of that sense of distance, that sense of living a different kind of life. But one of the things that's kind of mixed in there is that that all of these different items and these different kind of situations kind of bleed into each other. So, and for what it's worth, this is a hut of the hut of the falling persimmons, and so you can see here this persimmons, and it's in Kyoto. So, I got to Japan, so the other thing that's happening, actually, and this is another part of the thing I'd meant to say, is that I hope you'll bear with me. I always try to set up a couple of months to get the materials for this together, and then these lectures together, and then empty space on a calendar, and things you have to do always seem to pop up. So, and as we approach this, I think the idea of this is that we're kind of looking at books, right? We're looking at how, if we're not in Japan, how we're looking at texts and what we can get from texts, and how we can use texts to kind of develop an understanding of Japanese gardens. So and there are a lot of books, and I mean, there are a huge number, and the thing that I ended up landing on is that rather than kind of trying to provide you with a list of, I'll read these 5 books and you'll know everything you need to know, it's if we can have people come away from this with a sense of how to ask questions about books, right? How to read a book, and what does the author know about gardens in Japan, or what do they know about Japan? Can they speak and read Japanese? Do they know some Japanese history? Are they able to position Japanese gardens in a kind of a specific historical context, right? So one of the things, and so then then another thing about this is that there are these kind of narratives about Japanese gardens. One of the ones that has emerged really in the last, I think the idea that Japanese gardens are these kind of meditative spaces with the tranquility, these ideas of harmony. There's a kind of a reading of that, an idea of that Japanese gardens are supposed to make you calm, right? And there's this kind of, it's like a succession, it's like a telephone game, a succession of kind of misinterpretations of an idea, maybe. And one of the things when I was in Kyoto, the first summer I was in Japan, we were working in this garden. This is the North Garden at Entokuin. In Kyoto, we were restoring this garden, and this is that garden kind of recently, so it's after the restoration we did. And this is a kind of a fairly dramatic and powerful garden, right? And it's intended to be that way. So we'll revisit this garden in a little bit, but it starts asking these questions, right? And while we were working on that garden, so that was the first summer I was apprenticing, we were working in that garden. And then while we were working in that garden, I'd be kind of staying late, after we got back to work. So we would work about 10 or 11, maybe 12 hours a day usually. So then we would get back and we would kind of put the tools away and head back home. And I would, as often as I was able to, I would stay after work, and Kitayama Yasuo, I would ask Kitayama, who's the person I was apprenticing to, I wanted to understand these gardens, because I'd read, I'd kind of read this literature, and then the books that I'd read as an undergraduate was this kind of things like, this is an illustration from a book published in 1938, written by Samuel Newsom, Japanese Garden Construction. And it has these illustrations in it. So I sat down, I managed on a brief trip home, I managed to get a print copy of this book. And this is before the internet, so and before smartphones. So having a thing in your hand that you can take back and sit down with Kitayama and say, can you explain this to me? It's like, the landscape expressing the condition of the minds of wise men, right? And so you've got this idea of this image of like that hut I showed you earlier, this kind of like poet's retreat in the fields northwest of Kyoto. And Kitayama completely lost his temper with me. If you're going to study this stuff, I don't know why you would waste my time apprenticing to me. And, I don't know, and like, and so on and so forth. So, which was not at all the response I'd been expecting. I'd kind of taken these texts that I was reading at face value. And so this kind of started a series of questions for me, right? So if, and at some level, what's wrong with this, right? That if it was that much of a reaction, there's something wrong with this text. And so that's kind of another key part of this talk today is what's, why are some things wrong? It's like if there's no right answer, but there are a lot of wrong ones. It was kind of that sense of things. And it gets back to looking at this garden at Entokuin, where there's this kind of like, there's this real richness to kind of this garden or any of the other really good gardens but they're also very specific, right? And so these abstract illustrations, and then kind of the next step in the story for me, in terms of this kind of, and this is just a screen grab of the WorldCat that I took today. I meant to take it a week ago. And the thing that's really interesting about this, so I did a degree in architectural theory mid-career. And when I went to, it was at UW doing a degree in a master's of science in architectural history and theory. And in the process of doing that degree, my advisor said, you should do an annotated bibliography of Japanese gardens. And so I decided to just focus on English language literature. And as an undergraduate, I'd kind of reviewed about 20 or 30 books and used a handful for this thesis that I'd written. But, I decided to really kind of, in retrospect, somewhat naively kind of think like, okay, I'll review all of the books in English. And if you look at this middle line here, retained filters, clear filters, showing 1 to 10 of 23,400 results. So, and about 4 days ago, it was 1 to 10 of 23,380 results. So the stunning thing about Japanese gardens is that it's one of the most, in English, it's one of the most published subjects. English gardens are first, which is unsurprising. French gardens are second. And Japanese gardens are third, with more books being published about Japanese gardens than about Italian gardens, for example, which is the fourth. So I basically then spent about 10 days just culling through these lists of books to get the bibliography down to some kind of scale. And then also, it's the internet. And so you can kind of get these digital copies of books, or I would have access. So I wasn't dependent, like I was when I was an undergraduate, dependent on card catalogs and driving to a library or waiting for an interlibrary loan. So the really the story of Japanese garden books in English starts in 1893 with the fellow here on the left, Josiah Conder, a British architect who was responsible, or who was brought to Japan to start the architecture program at what's now Tokyo University. And this, one of his more famous buildings, this building that was built to house foreign dignitaries, the Rokumeikan, in the 1880s. So more relevant to this, this is Josiah Conder's, this is a page from Josiah Conder's book, and a garden built in about 1900 in Minneapolis by somebody who'd met Conder and read his book. And you know, the thing about this, so looking back now, what I can say about these illustrations, and you'll notice a kind of similarity between the illustration here from Josiah Conder's book and the earlier illustration that we saw. If you look at this, there's this kind of similar style to them, right? And we'll get into that in just a little bit. I just want to observe that right now. And you know, if you look at this garden, right, so it's this black and white image. It's kind of an old black and white image. Here's this kind of lantern, right? And so you can kind of see, you know, this lantern kind of mirrors this kind of lantern, right? And this hill on the left, we're actually looking at this garden. So if you look carefully, you'll notice that this is a bridge, right? And so this garden is actually intended to be viewed from a person who would be standing over here. And so then on the left side of the frame, we have this bamboo fence, and this kind of this hill on the right, this you know, this waterfall, these boulders. And so, you know, fairly early on, these garden manuals, and Josiah Conder's garden manual is kind of being used to build these gardens, right? But so then the question is, where do these illustrations come from, right? And so the story then, and Josiah Conder had a co-author. This is a thing that happens quite often with Japanese books about Japanese gardens, is that you'll find a co-author who actually has done this research or done this kind of work. In Josiah Conder's case, it was somebody named Kinkichiro Honda, or Honda Kinkichiro, to use the Japanese order. And Honda was the person who made these collotype plates for Conder's book. So if we look at Honda's work, Honda's work is a modernization of a book by another author. And so, you know, we're kind of looking now in the late 19th century with Honda. The 1863 is the opening of Japan, is the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. So kind of from a Western perspective, 1863 is the beginning of history in Japan, right? From a Japanese perspective, the 19th century was very, and the 18th century was very active. So you had these, this kind of an established urban middle class. So you had 60 towns with populations above 10,000. So it's, for example, Japan in the 17th, 18th, and the 19th century was much more urban, for example, than England was at the same time. And in about the same land area. So you had these concentration, these cities with concentrations of people who had disposable income and the leisure and the ability to travel. So when we look at Honda's work, Honda was actually reproducing a work that had been printed in 1828 by somebody named Akisato Rito. And Akisato is best known for these tourist guidebooks. So I think probably everybody, well, I'm going to leave this as a quiz. This is a very well-known garden. I think a lot of people may have already recognized it. And if you haven't, we're going to talk about this for a little bit longer. So, and for those of you who can read the Japanese, the name is, oh, my mouse has disappeared. The name of the garden is, oh, there you go. The name of the garden is right here in the upper right corner. The main hall, right? So So Akisato in 1780, and then kind of revising it. This is from a 1799 copy of this guidebook. It was a tourist guide for people visiting Kyoto, Japanese people visiting Kyoto. So these kind of people down here in the foreground, kind of looking at this garden and a description of the garden and kind of what to do while you're there. So it's like an 18th century Lonely Planet guide for Japanese people. And of course, this is the garden we were talking about, Ryoanji, which, one of the other things, so as you're reading books, right, we're talking about kind of reading books now, and I'm trying to focus on or give you the full picture of when you're reading in English. And of course, if you talk about Ryoanji, there's this kind of stupefying volume of work that's been published, analyses of this garden at Ryoanji. Just the number of analyses of this garden is truly, it just is beyond, it's, and for me as a gardener and as a historian, one of the most interesting things about Ryoanji is that the history of Ryoanji is really not very well known. It's really unclear exactly when the garden was built, who built the garden, the context for it being built, exactly the layout of the buildings that are adjacent to the garden. So, which isn't true for a lot of Japanese gardens. For a lot of gardens, there's these records that go back to the very beginning of the garden. And so kind of how the garden emerged, who was responsible for it, for these 4, 5, 6, and even 700-year-old gardens. It's not always exactly clear, but you have a pretty good sense. For Ryoanji, there's this kind of really not a good sense of what was happening there. What that does is that it makes it possible for any analysis to be possible. So as a historian, right, if you have a building that you know when it was built and who it was built for and who it was built by, those things are kind of then facts, and you kind of have to have a story that conforms to what you know about these people. And of all the analyses, this one in the bottom is John Cage's analysis, 5R/7, where R equals Ryoanji. And I think of all of the things, I think this is probably the most illuminating, just to kind of tell that part of the story. So this kind of absence of history then makes it possible for something to happen, which is that, and this is something you'll see a lot in books about Japanese gardens and in discussion about Japanese gardens, is that somehow Japanese gardens are eternal and timeless, and that they express all of these kind of really abstract concepts. And then you kind of, there are these ways of kind of, that people apply all of these innovative and inventive ways to kind of demonstrate these things that when you're apprenticing in Kyoto, just get you in huge amounts of trouble. If you go and say this, if you sit down with Oyakata, with the person you're apprenticing, and it's going to say, I thought of this amazing thing, or I read this amazing thing, and it's like, oh God, my, what do you, I can see that if I go back and say this again, it's like, what did you spend the last, 25 years of your life doing? And specifically in Japanese cultural studies. So one of these things that we just mentioned is when people talk about kind of something being ahistorical. So the event isn't tied to a particular time in history, or the garden that you're talking about isn't tied to a particular time in history, and that the roots of this are also kind of timeless, right? So, for example, if you take the way of tea, what most people kind of know as tea ceremony, right? You can look at this and say that tea is not native to Japan. So at some point in time, tea arrives in Japan. And then after that point in time, people begin to drink powdered tea. And in the kind of context of drinking powdered tea, all of these practices emerge. So this thing, it's not some ageless part of Japanese culture. It's a particular part of Japanese culture that has a history to it. And the other thing that a lot of Japanese academics, and probably me in lesser extent than some people I know, get frustrated with is this idea of essentialism. And this idea of essentialism is this idea that, you know, the culture is kind of universal to the people. So an individual person is not actually an agent of their own, but they're just a vessel for kind of reproducing this culture. So that's a little aside there, but it's one of the kind of questions, right? When you read, or, you know, if you're looking at a book about Japanese gardens, you know, what's being said? How are they saying these things? Are they talking about the person or the particular event around the construction of any given garden? So then also in the process, so I found all of these analyses of Ryoanji while I was kind of doing this bibliography. And also while I was doing this, I found this article. The article's in Japanese. Kind of the real key to this it makes it worth putting out up on your screens is item number 2. No correspondence was found between the dimensional speculations and so on and so forth. So, and by the time I was reading this, I'd already realized this in Japan, that there's the garden manuals that you see and the gardens that you visit in Kyoto. There's kind of no particular relationship between those. The garden manuals are kind of one thing, and then the gardens that were built, a lot of them are actually older than the garden manuals that you're going to be looking at. And then this in Japanese is kind of a list of the 20 manuals that the authors of this article reviewed. Sakuteki, this oldest garden manual, and the oldest existing copy of this is from 1289. It was believed to be published kind of in the late 11th century, so about 200 years or 250 years before this date. You know, and then these other books. Well, if you scroll down with your mouse like that, that's what happens. These other books, and you can kind of see these dates, right? So, you know, this is like 11th century, 13th, and then kind of 16th century. And then we get to the 17th century. And you see this huge proliferation kind of after the 17th century, then the 18th century. And so that urban middle class, the wealthy traveling middle class that I was talking about, really emerges then in the 18th century. And you can see that kind of evidence when you look back through these historical records, and you kind of see that part of this urban middle class that evolves or emerges is a better word, emerges in the 18th century is this fascination with books and this very active publishing industry based in Kyoto and kind of also publishing in Edo. And so, you know, and then down here, they actually, let's see here. I've got it, there you go. I don't know if I'm moving that, Ken. I'm just trying to get it so I can see. Yeah, they don't actually include Akisato's publication of this book, Tsukiyama Teizo Den, which, so this 1735 book, which is the book we were looking at, illustrations in Samuel Newsom's book, the book we looked at in Josiah Conder's book, was first published in 1735 as Chikuyama Niwa Tsukuriden. So this is the same characters. You can have two different readings, but then you can see these kind of this series of publications. So I threw this in for a reason. The reasons completely slipped my mind, but it's this is an early 16th century garden. Maybe we should just stop and take a little bit of a breath. Maybe that's why I put it in there. This is the garden in Ryukoin, which oh, there you go. So this is the garden attached to Ryukoin, which is where Suzuki Daisetsu. So anybody who's a student of Zen will know Suzuki Daisetsu, kind of this Zen monk who really started publishing books in English. And Lorraine Kuck, who was one of the early scholars of Japanese gardens, kind of writing at about the same time as Samuel Newsom. She was a little bit, I think, publishing a little bit before him, but it was kind of in the temple attached to this garden where the idea of Zen gardens kind of really came into existence in the 1930s. So then so we're going to go back to tour guides. There's a little bit of an aside for us. And this is, for anybody who's been to Kyoto, you'll kind of know Shijo Kawaramachi, this kind of district kind of in the center of town. This is Shijo Kawaramachi in 1780, so 240 years ago or so. This kind of lively district, the kind of, these kind of it gives you a sense, right, for what's happening in Japan at that time. And then this kind of, just to continue this idea of these books and how many of them are published, this is a 1735 copy of Kitamura Enkin's Tsukiyama Teizo Den, and it's on auction on Yahoo Auctions. I think you can buy copies of this, the later 19th century publications. You can get a copy of an original copy of one of these books for about $30 or $25. So the publishing world and the world of books and the worlds of reading was prolific at this time, right? So this copy, this 1735 copy, I think, was like 5,000 to 7,000 yen when I looked at it. Oops. There you go. So this kind of, that publishing world is one of the worlds, right? And then I want to take a look now at this other world and kind of then try and weave these two back together. Is this idea of historical specificity, that gardens in Japan, how they're changing over time, and how, as an audience, when you're reading books, you can kind of look at things and recognize some different things that are happening. When I came to Seattle, I was involved with the Seattle Japanese Garden, and that garden was built by a gardener, or it was primarily attributed to an author, a gardener named Juki Ida, who was active in the mid-20th century. So he built the Seattle Japanese Garden in 1960. He was kind of active for another, I think about another 10 years after that, built it near the end of his career, and had been active, so like in the 1940s and 50s. Ida introduced a style. He's kind of primarily credited, although people around him, this idea was emerging around him. But he kind of invented this style of gardens called Zokibayashi. And Zokibayashi is this poetic term that emerged in the late 19th century of using a Zokibayashi was basically a coppice woodlot. So in the villages outside of Edo and the Musashino Plain, and what's kind of all now covered in Tokyo, before all of that was covered in Tokyo, it was this rural plain, and out on this plain, this Musashino Plain, there would be these villages that would have these woodlots around them, and they would have this kind of group of different kinds of trees, and it looks like this tree trunk here looks like it might be one. It was kind of types of oaks and kind of Japanese kinds of small chestnuts and other trees that are not garden trees. So this whole idea that Ida originated was this idea of building gardens with trees that are not garden trees. And there's a whole poetry around that. But it's this completely new idea. And so when you look at these gardens like this one on the left, these are two these are both gardens that were built by contemporary Japanese garden designers working in the Tokyo area. But these gardens are kind of distinct. You know, this is an older garden, right? This is Shibarikyu in Tokyo, and this kind of wide open scene. If you look at this scene, these small pine trees kind of going into the distance. You know, again, we have a stone lantern here. This kind of pattern of the stones on the islands. If you look at these, when I look at these as a garden designer, this is just clearly a mid-Edo period garden, partly because of the scale, but partly also just because of the way, you know, these trees are shaped, and there's just kind of characteristics, right? So this is one of the things that also, it's probably the part that you can't necessarily get from books. I think you can get it from books. Like I always recommend people look at actually picture books, because that's where you can see the things that are kind of most relevant to understanding gardens. This is an earlier Edo period garden. And you know, you can see this is, I mean, for one thing, it's much closer. The garden is much closer to the viewer. And the scale is different, right? The relationship between the person and the scale is different. And so to kind of talk about the things you might see, right? You know, and it's not, it's very active, right? In terms of being a garden, it's actually connected. It's in Nishihonganji. It's one of the main temples of one of the schools of Pure Land Buddhism. And so this is inside a temple grounds. It's not a Zen temple garden, but it's got this early 17th century kind of energy to it, and a dry waterfall in the background. And, you know, not necessarily, I mean, for me as a gardener, this is not what I would look at to kind of, you know, enter a state of reflective tranquility. It's something that's meant to entertain and enliven the audience. Here again, and so this is a slightly older garden. It's still Momoyama period. And so we still have, as we look at this is Entokuin again, right? You know, look at these upright stones, look at the scale of these stones, and kind of this, again, it's this very forceful energy. Forceful garden. It was built for Hideyoshi at his castle in Fushimi. And then transported here at the beginning of the Edo period. So, and you can also see between these two gardens, you can kind of see a difference in style in the way stones are used, right? So, you know, these flat top stones, and as you start to kind of look at this, and then this is again an older garden. This is a early 16th century, at the very beginning, kind of in the first decade or two of the 16th century, attributed to the monk Soami, who's famous in a number of arts, and you know, this is in one of the sub-temples of Daitokuji in Kyoto, and a much more restrained and kind of quiet garden, and you know, kind of has a very different role in its relationship to the viewer and the relationship to the site. And then this is even older again. This is early 14th century. This is the dry waterfall at Tenryuji. Tenryuji having originally been built as a detached palace for the emperor in northwestern Kyoto. And so it's a fairly energetic garden, but again, it's, you know, if you study the stones, and the only way I can think to say you're going to be able to do that is just looking at gardens a lot. I just can't really offer any shortcuts to that process. But you know, there are more stones in this garden, right? But the kind of nature, if we go back to this dry waterfall, this part of this garden is a dry waterfall here. This is a dry waterfall here. These are kind of, and this is an entirely different garden. I've followed this historical pattern and then had this kind of Zen temple, dry landscape garden, poked in the middle of 3 historical dry waterfalls. So then if we go back to these books, kind of this gets us back. This is Higashiyama. This is a pagoda that's kind of south of Kodaiji in Higashiyama. And Tsukiyama Teizo Den, this is the frontispiece of Aki Sato's 1828 publication of this. And one of the things this speaks to, that's a kind of another historical artifact, is this kind of appeal to being, this is very Chinese. This image is very Chinese. And so Lorraine Cuck, in her introduction to her book about Japanese gardens in 1940, her first chapter is about Chinese gardens. So one of the things you run into is that Japanese gardens are based on Chinese gardens. And it's kind of a peculiar, it's a curious thing that there is a relationship between, you know, Chinese writing, right? This is all in Kanbun. This is Chinese script, is kind of literally what Kanbun means. But in the Edo period, there was this kind of formalized Neo-Confucianism. So there's this kind of strong influence of a particularly Chinese kind of approach to governing and culture, but not necessarily in earlier periods, right? So one of the things is that as you look at history, you can say, so some of the things you see in the early 20th century are kind of looking through this lens of a kind of a historical or a historical moment where Chinese culture was being elevated. And this, so then if we look at this is an image of, it's a reproduction of the tale of Genji from the Edo period. And you kind of have these, you know, this is going to be Genji, and I've forgotten which chapter it is. And so you see this relationship between literature and a cultural context, and then the literature that's used. So in the tale of Genji, poetry is a very dominant force in Heian period culture. So we're talking about the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, and that poetry carries throughout the rest of Japanese history. But the key forms of Japanese poetry are really formulated in the late 19th century. And that collection of poems called the Kokinshu starts out with this preface that discusses how that relies very heavily on natural imagery. So when in Japanese garden studies, when people discuss natural images, natural imagery, the roots for that are very deep. This kind of relationship between Japanese culture, Japanese gardens, and kind of the natural scenery of Japan. And so at the beginning of, for example, in Josiah Condra's introduction to his book, he discusses this kind of particular relationship between the scenery of Japan and the scenery in Japanese gardens. And this is something, when I was doing this bibliography I was working on, I read a couple of books. I was looking at some books in English and some books in Japanese, and it seemed that within the first 30 pages, they would say Japanese garden, Japan is an island country, and because Japan is an island country, Japanese people make Japanese gardens, or some variation of that statement. And I thought, wow, I wonder how many books say this. And so I started to kind of pull down these books, and and I'd kind of like emptied the shelf of books, and they all said some variation of this. And then my undergraduate major was in anthropology. So as an anthropologist, I thought, well, if Japan is an island country, so Japanese people make Japanese gardens. If you look at Korea, the coastline of Korea. Korea and Japan are very close culturally. It's a troubled history. But if you look at the historical architecture and there's a lot of similarities, right? The first temple carpenters in Japan were actually Koreans. So there's this very deep history there, but of connection. And if you look at a map, of South Korea, the coastline is amazing. It's islands. It's a really complex coastline. It's a steep, rugged country with narrow mountains. And so if there's this deep connection, why don't Korean people make Korean gardens that are something like Japanese gardens? And they don't. And then you can look at Taiwan, again, an island country that's like less similar, but still fairly similar to Japan. They don't make gardens like Japanese gardens. And England is a country, and they don't make gardens that are anything remotely like Japanese gardens. So when you look at that argument, what's underneath that argument? What's the assertion that's being made, right? Is there this causal relationship, or is it just this kind of thing that's being fabricated or kind of misinterpreted, right? This is this telephone game. So you start out with Japanese authors and Josiah Condor kind of speaking with these Japanese authors and saying that there's a relationship between Japanese ideas of natural beauty, which emerge from the particular beauty of Japan, and then this kind of cultural practice of Japanese gardens. So which is, and again, probably this doesn't make it into books because the editors say, I want that in 2 sentences or a paragraph. So if we look now, we're going to just kind of look at things that are printed and try and kind of get a sense for this, right? So this is from a period before there were a lot of guidebooks. This is a 16th century scroll. There's these kinds of, folding screen. It's not scrolls. And of these kind of the scenes in and around Kyoto. So, the 18th century guidebooks are kind of preceded by these 16th and 17th century folding panels. I'm looking for my mouse. So we're looking at Kyoto. For people who are familiar with Kyoto culture, we've got Gion Matsuri happening. And so this means this is the Shijo Bridge. This is going to be the I think this should actually be the Sanjo Bridge, right? So Sanjo, for people who know Kyoto, is the beginning of the Tokaido. So when you're there, right, over here at the left of the screen is the Imperial Palace. And so there's these kinds of scenes, right? And you kind of look at these and before you go to Kyoto, it's really fun because you can look at these and then understand that you're walking in an urban environment and that parts of the urban environment have been in place for quite some time, for centuries, right? This is, the Imperial Palace is still there. These mansions, of course, are all gone. So this is the other side of the screen. This is the west side of Kyoto, the capital, right? And so Arashiyama, this is Tenryuji. Here's the Garden of Tenryuji back in here. Here's the Togetsukyo, this famous bridge, if you ever visit. And then we can kind of look at these, right? And as a garden historian, these things are really interesting because you can look at these and see this layout of gardens, this entry court here. And so these kind of become the sources then, right? Much more than kind of books that are going to kind of explain these things, as you're studying these. And then, as we get older still, this is a reproduction of a Heian period scroll, and kind of shows this Heian period garden. And it's my mouse, there you go. I had to stitch it together, and so there's these kind of disconnects a little bit, but you can get this sense for this pond style, and so you can kind of look through and get a sense in reading for how different things were fitting together through time. And I think I've ended my material there. the kind of as you go in, this is an Edo period print. Yeah, and so I'd like to open it up for questions. If there's anybody who kind of has something particular they want to hear about, or any kind of anything you want me to elaborate.
No questions so far, Mark. Unless anyone want to type in, send your questions via chat. We're happy to ask now, but if not, we can keep moving.
Great.
All right.
Let's see here. I'm going to close that. You probably are all, I don't know which parts of my screen everybody's seeing and which parts you're not.
It's a blank screen now.
The blank screen now. Well, let's fix that then. So one of the things, and this is kind of part of this thing that you, like I said, you schedule these things months in advance, and you leave yourself kind of, this amount of time to prepare things, and then work hates a vacuum. And so if you look at bibliographies in terms of specific books, right? One of the things that I find is my preference for reading materials is to really focus on either historical books, and so there's one author whose name is Dutch, I believe, Wade Kotich, Kuitert. He's published 2 books about the history of Japanese gardens. The awkward thing here for me is that as I went through this, I think, I'll recommend this set of books to people. And I realized that all of the books that I refer to when I'm doing research about gardens, or when I'm kind of just trying to think through, as a designer, you kind of are trying to think through some sort of a problem, right? And when I try to think through problems, and I'm kind of, or just, I like to relax by looking at pictures of Japanese gardens. So, and when I do that, the way that the books that I look at are either particular books about Japanese individuals, and those are usually in Japanese, and very hard to find outside of Japan, unfortunately, still. Or they are books that it turns out are almost all out of print. So Wade Kotich, and I think what I'll have to do is will we be able to do this? Can maybe append a list of books for people?
Yeah, absolutely.
Somehow we'll append this, and I think I don't know how we'll make that happen, but the maybe as a link in the YouTube posting for this video, or maybe if I think we have everybody's email. Maybe we can just send it out as an email to everybody who's here.
Yeah, we can do both. We can include a link of all the referred books, as well as an email to the attendees today.
That sounds great. So but then the books, so properly kind of actually putting Japanese gardens in a kind of a context, right? So if you put these Japanese gardens, if you put the gardens that you're looking at into a context that's kind of particular to gardens, which is these garden histories by this Dutch scholar who was living in Kyoto for many years. But then also you put them in the context of books about Japanese culture. So there's a book, Japan, the culture of four seasons, by a Japanese author, and then also kind of some more recent kind of critical things. There's a book, a lot of the analysis for Ryoanji, for example, was done by an author in Japanese and translated into English, in a book called Shots in the Dark, which for people who are kind of prepared to take a critical view of the role of Zen in Japanese culture, that's an excellent book to read. Somewhat challenging read, but still a really good resource. And then the kind of the other books that I looked at a lot, there's a book that shows, so there's a book about these screens that kind of discusses in detail these books. And then, so kind of that group of books will be available or will be listed for people to kind of get and read.
And Mark, these are translated.
These are all in English. Yeah, they're either written. These are actually books that were all written in, well, except for Shots in the Dark. I should point that out. But yeah, they're all written in English. So they're kind of, that's what I'm thinking, is that these are books that will be accessible and kind of, they're not a coffee table read. They're a little bit more serious than that. But that's, I think there are so many books, you can kind of pick up. There are just so many books. It's amazing. And the qualifications of the people who write them are also kind of surprising sometimes. It's I really like Japanese gardens, and I really like Japan, and I'm a garden designer, so I wrote this book. And you're kind of like, okay, so fair enough. Yeah, so if there are no questions, if I don't think I could have possibly answered everything anybody has to ask, but so.
Well, there is, there's a comment. Anyway, what I was saying was, this was a pretty dense lecture, Mark. So maybe folks are still processing the information that was just given, and it's good because it's not the typical. Okay, well, this is what a Japanese garden is, and your lectures are never straightforward like that, right? Because there is no simple answer to the sort of complicated questions, I suppose. So. Maybe you could discuss how folks can, really start a Japanese garden in areas that are, climatically challenging, say, for example, the climates are vastly different in Japan versus, say, California. Maybe Seattle, not so much. It's pretty similar, but you can.
Seattle is super unchallenging for me as a Japanese garden designer, that's for sure. After I was in the Bay Area, I grew up in the Bay Area, and then I moved back there after living in Japan, and I did a lot of work with native plants in the Bay Area. California is so dramatically unlike Japan. So for me, let's find something that's kind of, let's just use this as an example, right? I think when I look at Japanese gardens now, so this ties in a little bit to the kind of discussion about symbolism, right? And poetry, that when I build gardens for my clients, when in the work I do, and when I think about the gardens that I build, I don't think about symbolism at all. I do think about narrative, but the narrative notion of the garden really comes last, and the thing that comes first, or it kind of comes, it emerges as a separate thing. It emerges out of the process of the relationship between the garden just as a simple object and the viewer as this rich and complex beings with awareness that we are, right? As a gardener, what I'm working with is just the raw materials and just the space. And so this garden, if we look at it, there's my mouse, right? We have this rectangle of space. The rectangle is bounded at the back by this wall. And this wall forms the outside wall of the place where the garden is built. So the structure here is open to the garden, right? But the garden and the structure are not two distinct things. So this is one thing to understand, is that people say the garden is kind of mediating between the built environment and the natural world. The garden is part of the built environment. And historically, there were not architects in Japan, there were gardeners. And so the houses, the structures were built by craftsmen, and the places were designed by gardeners. So and this is one of the confounding things about talking about gardens in English, is that gardens kind of always come in this secondary role. It's a little bit of a vulgar term, but I once had a landscape architect talking about kind of the parsley round the pig, with this idea that the gardening is just kind of this green garnish around this thing that's neither particularly useful nor particularly interesting for the people who are sitting down to eat. So then when you look at this, the thing then is, and I'm kind of saying this with the expectation that I'm sending everybody away to study, or that you're interested in studying, or that you kind of have some interest of your own in these gardens. As craft, the things then that matter are these kinds of spaces that are made, right? These azaleas that look like they've kind of grown up and have just kind of azaleas in Japanese gardens just grow. They just kind of show up. It's like if you, in the Northwest, if you have a Japanese maple in your garden, you're going to spend kind of a few weeks every summer weeding out Japanese maples that show up all over your garden, right? And azaleas in Japan, and camellias to a lesser extent, do the same thing. So you'll find these kinds of like clumps of azaleas a lot. And as a garden historian, you kind of look at these and wonder if this little clump of azaleas was always here and always kind of swallowing these two rocks like this. But you can kind of look at this spacing, right? And then look at these different relationships. Those analyses of Ryoanji, to go back to these, of all, I'm going to just, there you go. Of all of these, this is the oldest one. This author didn't attribute it to, I think that something like this shows up in a 1930, or in the 1930s as an analysis of this garden. And this analysis kind of gets you the closest. Let's see if I can get my mouse to come back, to kind of seeing a little bit how these different planes and these different spaces in the garden are kind of divided up, just in terms of like in a strict structural sense of how the space is organized. And then, of course, in terms of actually conveying the spiritual meaning of the garden, I'm still going to stick with this as the most accurate. So then let's go back to this garden. This is, and so then we can kind of start to look at this kind of linear plane almost, and it's not entirely linear, right? And so the ways in which that line is broken up, and the ways in which this open space here, which is maybe 5/6 of the space or something, right, divides. And so when you're doing that, when you're practicing that, a lot of that is cultivating a sensibility in the same way that, for example, a musician, like like if you listen to jazz or something, right? Or like if you watch dance, or if, you look at paintings or kind of any other art form, right? So as an artist, you're cultivating a particular, and in Japan, this is just as true as it is in any other art, in any other place, that as an individual artist, you're cultivating kind of this idiosyncratic, your particular sense of timing and spacing and the relationship between these things. And so these gardens that survive, these great gardens, are the ones that kind of have these compositions that are really particularly compelling.
Sorry, Mark, not to cut you off. We do have a couple questions. If you want to take them now. Okay. So Danielle Altieri, it says, what a fantastic lecture, by the way. They're an Italian garden designer based in Kent, UK. And they visited Kyoto 20 years ago, and where they worked in Hokkaido for three months, designing English gardens full of roses and lavenders. That's what the Japanese loved. And then they visited a Western Japanese garden in Paris, Jardin Khan. And, it's a pretty good garden there. Yeah. And however, they're saying, as Irish people say, Guinness, the beer doesn't travel well. It's best, you know, consume there. Their question is, how does a Japanese garden travel westwards?
Yeah, that's a whole, I mean, that's a whole, so the first Japanese garden, and Christian Tagshold, I think I'm getting that right. I always transpose the G and the S in their name. Wrote a book which he makes a very convincing, or he makes the argument quite well, and he's kind of one of these people, along with like Yamada Shoji and kind of Wade Kotech, who's kind of looking at the particular history of these things. So the first Japanese garden, what's arguably the first Japanese garden in the world, is made in 1873 for the Vienna World's Exposition. And it's made as a Japanese national government effort to project. So a lot of these things we're talking about, this kind of like timeless Japanese tradition. They send these Japanese craftsmen to Vienna to build this garden. The Empress of Prussia sees these carpenters working on the bridge, and they're wearing this kind of 1870s Europe. They're kind of wearing this quaint costume. So that a lot of the public gardens then, that as world fairs, these kinds of, like all of these different places, there were kind of a couple in England. There was one in 1910 at Shepherd's Bush that's been pretty well researched, are being built as a kind of as a projection of this kind of essential Japanese culture. It gets back to this idea of essentialism, that this culture is kind of like timeless, and that all Japanese people are just this vessel for this thing that's beyond who they are. And so the trouble that a lot of the public gardens have, or from a design perspective, the thing that you look at them, and if you look at this garden, for example, this is the Ryogin-tei in Ryogin-in Daitokuji. It's a particular garden, and this garden isn't about anything other than just being this garden, right? So if you look at this garden in Paris, and so like when you're talking about how do Japanese gardens travel, the question then is what's the thing that's traveling, right? That the thing that's traveling isn't necessarily like this creative idea. The thing that's traveling is this kind of bureaucratic notion of the projection of a national image, which you can imagine is a really bad place to put the foundations for a garden. And so that, I think that's kind of part of the question, right? So then, and it gets back to, Ken, what you're saying about like, how do you build gardens? Because, Northern Europe, and the British Isles are certainly not Kyoto, right? I mean, it's just a very different place. But then, I think somehow my Instagram feed every once in a while shows up with some of the images of like some of the relict rainforests that are in the British Isles, which are these just phenomenal places of natural beauty. And that the core principles, these ideas of spacing and relating different elements, and how do you extract, or how do you kind of express in a small space that infinite beauty? How do you capture that scenery, and it's not like you're trying to capture the essence of the scene. What you're trying to do is capture the feeling, right? You want to have that feeling of whatever that feeling is. And that is something I think that you can do, but then you're probably not going to end up with what a purist might want to have be a Japanese garden. So.
And the comment to that is they think that all the garden design techniques travel comfortably, like shakkei.
Yeah, shakkei, borrowed scenery. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, that's one, right? I mean, because this garden doesn't have borrowed scenery, right? It's just got a roof that you can see over the wall. I mean, that's not borrowed scenery. The gardens where borrowed scenery is actually a thing is in that context. So with that phrase, and Teiji Ito has a book that in Japanese was called very literally Borrowed Scenery in Courtyard Gardens. and was translated into English and given the title Space and Illusion in the Japanese Garden, which, kind of underscores how I ended up giving this talk today, is that you have a Japanese book and the English book, the content is the same, right? But the title, like Space and Illusion in the Japanese Garden, is kind of suggesting something other than what he's talking about is borrowed scenery, which is a technique, and courtyard gardens, which is a form of garden. So it's very grounded in particular realities, right? When you talk about borrowed scenery, a lot of times the word scenery in Japan has this, if you go back to the Sakuteki, this oldest Japanese garden manual, this really old garden manual, kind of internationally by any standard. It says study places of famous scenic beauty. So by the 10th century and by the 11th century, there were these kind of standardized places of famous scenic beauty. And so if you read Matsuo Basho, you read like Okuno Hosomichi, like narrow roads to the interior or narrow roads to the far north. That collection of poetry, he's going to these places that are famous, that have this whole poetic tradition. So when they say kind of borrowed scenery in Japanese, when you say shake in Japanese, it has this kind of connotation. The thing you're bringing in, the thing that you're incorporating into the garden is somehow noteworthy, right? It's not just whatever's outside the garden you're bringing in. So that is an idea that travels well, but then in the nature of this talk, I'm going to complicate it. Wasn't that the word you used, Ken?
Yeah.
It is. I'm being a little bit unrestrained here. I'm just trying to.
No. So here's another question here. Who are some contemporary Japanese garden designers whose work you admire? And is there anyone that's breaking new ground on what a Japanese garden is?
Yeah, it's funny. When I went to Japan, I apprenticed to Kitayama Yasuo. At the time he was kind of really starting to kind of get some national recognition, and since then he's become nationally famous in Japan, and has kind of been recognized by the Japanese government for his work. So that was just really a stroke of luck for me. It wasn't it's what I set out to do, but I achieved it just by blind luck, not through any kind of actual diligent effort on my part. I'm really a traditionalist, right? And I kind of, in framing this lecture, I kind of deliberately decided to avoid talking about things that are happening now. In part because, there's the obvious, like, I think this person's good and I don't think that person's good or whatever, that I just didn't want to get into that kind of part of it. But then in part also it's that one of the challenges, right, is that so coming out of 20th century European thinking was this idea that you kind of have to be consistently innovating, right? And for me personally, this is just my personal view, is that I was actually much more interested in craft, and that there's a lot of modernism that doesn't age well. And so, there are a lot of good designers. I mean, like Shigemori Mide, this is going back like into the 30s, I realize, did these really innovative things, but some of it didn't age well. Some of it was really, really innovative and amazing. I actually really like, none of Juki Ida's gardens are still in existence. There's a book of his work, and it's quite rare. It's quite expensive. We have a copy in Seattle. And I quite like his work. And that's, I think for me personally, that's just, that's probably kind of my personal style is that it's this idea that you're kind of like breaking new ground. It's like, if you're just making something that's good and sticks to these fundamentals, is kind of where I am. So.
Great. Adding on to the initial question that I had asked about geography and location and transitioning the Japanese garden into a Western world or elsewhere globally, This question is about the garden that you're doing in Ecuador. Someone wants to know how you're going about designing the garden in Ecuador, the climate, plant materials, stone, relation to structures, etc. And
Yeah,
anything else that you'd like to share, because that's a completely different climate there.
it is. It is. So, yeah. So I have this great client. They contacted me after. So this is I think I said this is my second Zoom lecture. Or maybe I didn't say this. I think Ken and I were talking about this before. So this is my second, like not today, not this week, not this month. Like this is my second ever Zoom lecture, which is it's like basically the pandemic happened, and I work alone a lot outdoors with rocks, and so I continue doing that. But the last one I gave, I had a client who's or I had somebody contact me from and they're building a house in Ecuador, and I like got this contact and I thought this is very suspicious about the thing at first, but they're wonderful people. And some and in Puerto Cayo on the coast, like the house is literally on the beach. Like the high tide came up really high the other day and kind of washed away some of the plants on the beach. The architecture, this architect I'm working down there kind of was thinking about Japan and Japanese architecture, but then also like in Ecuador, there's this kind of structure of way of building things that's very similar. And so somewhere between that and this architect designing this really great house, the house is kind of in its fundamental structure, kind of very much a modern rendition of a Japanese structure. So it for me as a garden designer, it's very easy to just fit a Japanese garden to that space. I don't have any pictures of it. So we kind of, and the house is mid-construction right now, and we're going to finish the garden in a year, else I would have had pictures of it now. And then, so this garden we're looking at right now, the thing that the client had visited the South Garden at Rio Genin and been deeply moved by that garden. And that garden is it's 1980s, it's modern. And it's kind of very dramatic and powerful, and they wanted that dramatic power. And kind of also from a Japanese gardener perspective, you're kind of basically working on the beach. There's the Pacific Ocean right there. And so you have this place where the garden needs to have a certain amount of strength to it. So then the core structure of the garden and the stones are just like among the more Japanese things I've ever done. And then the plants in coastal Ecuador are completely different, right? And so this is that kind of question, like, how do you make this thing travel? But these kind of habits, this isn't a very thickly planted garden. I don't think I have any really heavily planted gardens here. Well, actually, so if you look at this garden, right? So if you look at this style, this Zokibayashi style, right? And these, this is, I don't think these are necessarily like up and coming or famous designers, but these are both people I really like both of these gardens. It's kind of why I chose to include them, right? If you look at this, for example, if you kind of take this, and this looks like it's like a Cryptomeria japonica, and probably like Buna, which is kind of like it's like some sort of like a beach relative. You can take these groups of trees and you can find things that are, and this involved having a nurseryman in Ecuador and going around a nursery, and then, also it's tropical. So I have some snake plants in my house, and I'm down there in Ecuador, and these things are just growing in the ground, right? I'm staying in this Airbnb to build this thing, and I walk out of the Airbnb, there's this like row of these snake plants, sansavearias. And so you can take these kind of sets of relationships, this kind of sense of the space and the way, like if you look at this, there's this kind of sense of space and how you're moving through the garden. So all of those things travel, right? Particular habits of like how many steps you take, or how you turn, or what kinds of things you see, or what kinds of things you hide and how you hide them. All of those things travel, and then the materials that you use to build them are actually really malleable. to kind of some extent. I mean, it's, when the garden's 10 years old, my goal is for it to be a roaring success, but my anticipation is that, and I have, with this architect we're working with, and with the gardeners and with the nurserymen we're working with, I have a group of people in Ecuador who I think are really will be able to work together well. So, yeah.
That's an exciting project. Maybe the third lecture, you can share some pictures there.
I hope so. Yeah.
Here's a last question for you, Mark. And this is one that, I don't think we've covered in the first lecture or this one. So here it goes. So hello from your friends at Green Gulch, by the way.
Oh, hi.
They're here, they're watching.
Uh-oh.
A question about koi and koi ponds. So does the design of these ponds and the introduction of koi fall to the landscape/garden designer? Do all ponds in Japanese gardens contain koi? What is the significance of their presence?
There it is. So this garden has koi in it, right? I think yes and no.
That should be the third lecture, Japanese koi pond gardens.
Right. So there's that. I mean, I think this is one of the challenges, right? Because a lot of these things, like when you hear this, you think like, well, yes and no, right? And so, and I don't know there were koi in ponds in Japan. Historically, I think for as long as there have been ponds, I'm trying to remember, there's a reference to koi, I think, in the Sakuteki. So this gets us back to the 11th century. This gets us back to kind of, a few hundred years, which, when you're looking at 1,200 or 1,000, kind of 400 years of garden history, not 1,400 really, that stretches it too much. But when you're looking at that kind of length of garden history, the beginnings get a little bit foggy. So there are two separate parts, right? There's koi, and it may be like, if I think about it as an analogy with bonsai, which is an art, and it's related to gardens, right? Koi are related to gardens because you have ponds in gardens, and ponds have koi in them sometimes. But then the kind of collections of koi and the idea of breeding koi is separate from the idea of building gardens. And somewhere, and I almost used it for this, but I've got this kind of picture of these two gold koi in this pond at Tenryuji. So there are these kind of colorful koi in other gardens, and so that's kind of a part of the gardens. But then, there's this kind of, it's almost like if you have a Venn diagram that kind of, there's ponds and there's koi, and the two overlap, and obviously wherever you have koi, you're going to have a pond, but not necessarily, you're not going to always have, wherever you're going to have koi, you're going to have water because they're fish. But not necessarily wherever you have water, you're going to have koi, right? There are going to be gardens that have ponds that don't have koi in them. Almost every garden pond I can think of has some turtles in it because it's a comparatively natural environment. It's a pond, and turtles are wandering around in Japan, so they wind up there. So, yeah, and so I think if I were gonna kind of write a lecture about it, I would want to give the lecture in the context that I'd actually want to kind of separate those two things. So we did, for example, while I was in Japan, we built a pond for somebody who had a really kind of a collection of koi. And we're gardeners, so we built a garden pond. We built a pond that looks, obviously not as big as this one at Tenryuji, but it was a garden pond. But then the structure of the pond was designed so that the water recirculates and you have the koi in it, right? And so those were kind of two things that overlapped but weren't necessarily functionally connected. So, and I didn't hear all of the different parts of the question. I didn't kind of remember them all, Can. But I think that would be the kind of the key thing I would.
I think you answered them.
Yeah, I think
essentially, not all Japanese garden has to have a koi pond. That's-
Exactly. Yes. I mean, right. Yeah. I mean, koi ponds equals Japanese gardens isn't something that I think that would be that's a sentence that'll get you into trouble. or it'll mislead you, right? I mean, the thing about this that I think, if you don't, if you think you don't know the answer, right? So curiosity and certainty exist in this relationship where curiosity lives where certainty is missing, right? And so if you have certainty, you lose curiosity. And if you lose curiosity, then you kind of stop growing, right? So, or so this Tenryuji is one of the first Japanese gardens that I actually saw in person. And to this day, I look at this garden and I don't quite understand it. I mean, I understand at some level, but there's, and it's like, it's like a song you like to listen to. You've memorized the entire song. You understand the whole thing perfectly well, but you still like to listen to it, right? And so that's the kind of a sense of curiosity, if you understand that kind of idea. And so then, like, if you allow in your study this space for kind of curiosity and this space that avoids, if you avoid kind of simple answers, then it becomes this kind of rich space for kind of continuing to enjoy things.
That's well said. I think that's fabulous. And, we do have a little bit of time. Do you have any closing remarks that you'd like to share with folks? Maybe an exciting talk next year, perhaps.
Oh, I'm going to have an exciting talk next year. Actually, my son's about to walk in the door. So, apparently, Ken's just invited me to give an exciting talk next year. Yeah. I think, I think the next thing that comes down the line, right? So these two were really meant to be reversed. This idea that, the idea of the earlier lecture I gave was that if you just look at the garden, that everything you need to know is just right there in front of you. And then this lecture was kind of, or this was what are the things that you're being presented with? I started out by reading. I think everybody starts out by reading, like I said. And then I should have not said anything after I made that comment about curiosity, because I think that's the thing that drives me forward, and makes it still lively for me, and kind of makes me interested in Japanese gardens still. Is that there's still something there, and even if I'm making it myself, there's still something there, and that's where the spark is. So,
thank you as always, Mark. This fabulous lecture.
Yeah.
And we'll just send over that list of books. We'll get that published along with this video on our library of videos, on LINXO's community resources page, as well as YouTube. And of course, this is recorded. Thank you again. Thank you from everybody in the audience. And hopefully we'll chat outside of this and come up with another class.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everybody.
Yep.